what really happened in a Viking battle. Not what the movies have been lying to you about, but the historical truth. No slow-mo battle scenes, no flowing locks of hair, just the cold, hard, brutal truth of what it was like to step off a longship onto a foreign shore and fight for your life. Let's start with the journey itself, because nobody talks about the misery of getting to the battle. You are crammed into a longship with 30 other men for weeks at a time. The smell hits you first, a mixture of unwashed bodies, fish, and fear that would make a teenage boy's bedroom seem like a spa. These ships had no bathrooms, no privacy, and definitely no comfort. The closest thing to a toilet was hanging your rear end over the side of the boat, while your buddies held onto your arms so you would not fall into the North Sea. Your stomach has been churning for days because longships were built for speed and shallow water, not comfort. They rode every wave like a roller coaster designed by someone who hated fun. The deck was barely wide enough for the rowing benches, so you are constantly bumping into your fellow warriors. Personal space was not a Viking concept. You ate, slept, and relieved yourself within arm's reach of men who had not bathed since leaving home weeks ago. Your fellow warriors are not the professional soldiers Hollywood shows you. Most Vikings were farmers, just like you. The real professional warriors, called the herd, were household troops who lived and trained with their lords year-round. But you are part of the Leidanger, the coastal militia, where every landowner had to serve for a set number of summer weeks. Think of it like jury duty, except instead of sitting in a courthouse listening to lawyers, you might die in a foreign country fighting people you have never met. The Leidanger system worked like this. Every district had to provide a certain number of fighting men based on the number of farms in the area. Rich farmers could send their sons or hired hands. Poor farmers had to go themselves. Everyone had to bring their own weapons and food for the journey. It was essentially a medieval draft system. But instead of getting drafted by your government, you got drafted by your local lord who wanted to get rich quick by raiding monasteries. The weapons you carry tell the real story of Viking warfare. Your axe is not some mystical battle weapon forged by dwarves in a mountain forge. It is literally the same tool you used to chop firewood back home. Archaeological evidence shows that most Viking axes were farming tools modified for war. The famous double-headed axes you see in movies never existed. Not one has ever been found in any Viking archaeological site. Viking axes were single-bladed and practical, designed to do maximum damage while being cheap to make and easy to repair. Your weapon has probably been repaired multiple times because good metal was expensive and hard to come by. Most weapons showed signs of multiple repairs, patches, and modifications. It was like driving a car that you kept fixing with duct tape and prayers, except if your car broke down in battle, you died instead of just being late for work. Swords were incredibly rare and expensive. Archaeological surveys show that fewer than 1 in 10 Viking graves contains a sword. This means that in a typical raiding crew of 30 men, maybe 2 or 3 would have swords. If you owned a sword, you were not just a warrior, you were wealthy enough to buy something that cost as much as a modern car. They were basically the Ferraris of the medieval world, impressive to look at, but impractical for most people. Most fighters carried spears instead. Spears were the assault rifles of the Viking Age, cheap to make, easy to use, and deadly effective. You could mass-produce spear points using basic metalworking skills. The shaft was just a straight piece of ash or oak wood, nothing fancy required. Point the sharp end at the enemy and let physics do the rest. A good spear thrust could punch through most armor and reach enemies who were still trying to get close enough to hit you with their axes. Spears also worked as throwing weapons. Vikings were skilled at hurling spears into enemy formations before charging in with axes and shields. This served 2 purposes. It disrupted enemy lines and eliminated some threats before close combat began. Think of it as medieval artillery, softening up the target before the main assault. Now let me destroy the biggest myth of all, the horned helmets. Not a single horned helmet has ever been found in a Viking Age archaeological site. Not 1, 0. The famous horned helmets people think of actually date to 900 BCE and were ceremonial Bronze Age pieces used in religious rituals, not battle gear. Real Viking helmets were simple iron caps with nose guards, practical protection that actually worked, instead of giving enemies convenient handles to grab during fights. The horned helmet myth started with 19th century opera costumes and romantic paintings. Artists wanted Vikings to look more dramatic and exotic, so they borrowed imagery from much older Bronze Age artifacts. It stuck in popular culture because it looked cool, even though it made no practical sense. Wearing horns into battle would be like painting a target on your head and then giving your enemies something to grab onto while they tried to cut your throat. Real Viking helmets were designed by people who understood that your head contains your brain, and that keeping your brain inside your skull was important for survival. They were simple, effective, and boring-looking compared to Hollywood versions. Some had mail curtains that protected the neck and shoulders. Others had decorative elements like bronze or silver inlays, but these were status symbols, not tactical accessories. The berserkers were real, but nothing like the movies show. These were not drug-fueled super soldiers running naked through the forest, screaming like maniacs. Modern historians believe berserkers were elite assault troops who used psychological techniques to enter altered mental states before combat. They practiced ritual breathing, war songs, and meditation methods that helped them overcome fear and fight more aggressively. Think of them as medieval special forces who used mental conditioning instead of modern training techniques. Berserkers were named after the bear shirts they wore into battle. Some wore wolf pelts instead, and were called Ulfhednar. These animal skins served both practical and psychological purposes. They provided extra protection and made the wearer look more intimidating. But they also connected the warrior to the spiritual power of predatory animals in Norse religious beliefs. Here's the thing about berserkers. They were just as likely to mess up their own formations if they lost control. Going berserk meant abandoning tactical discipline and fighting in a trance-like state. This could be devastating against disorganized enemies, but it could also break your own battle lines if berserkers charged at the wrong time or in the wrong direction. Smart commanders used berserkers as shock troops at specific moments, not as the backbone of their forces. Going into battle naked in Scandinavia was not bravery, it was hypothermia waiting to happen. The idea that berserkers fought naked probably comes from misunderstanding saga descriptions. They may have fought without mail armor, which would have seemed like fighting naked to medieval writers who saw armor as essential protection. The shield wall was the basic Viking battle formation, but it was nothing like the rigid phalanx you see in movies, called the Skjaldborg, or shield fort. It was more like a flexible human barrier, made of round wooden shields overlapping to create continuous protection. These shields were 80 to 95 centimeters across, made from linden wood planks, held together with iron fittings, and painted in bright colors that helped identify different units in the chaos of battle. Each shield weighed about as much as a bowling ball, and had to be held steady for hours at a time. Your left arm would be screaming with fatigue after just a few minutes of combat. The shield had a central iron boss that could be used offensively to punch enemies or deflect incoming weapons. The rim was often reinforced with iron or leather to prevent splitting when weapons struck the edge. Experimental archaeology shows that maintaining a shield wall required constant training and perfect coordination. Everyone had to move together, maintain proper spacing, and respond instantly to commands. One person breaking formation could collapse the entire line faster than a house of cards in a windstorm. The shield wall worked great for frontal protection, but it had serious weaknesses that smart enemies could exploit. Your vision was severely limited when fighting in formation. You could only see what was directly in front of you through narrow gaps between shields. You had no idea what was happening on the flanks or behind enemy lines. Commands had to be relayed by voice, since you could not see hand signals. The noise of combat made hearing difficult, so orders were often missed or misunderstood. The physical demands were enormous. Holding a heavy shield while wielding weapons with your right hand was incredibly tiring. Men would collapse from exhaustion after just a few minutes of intense fighting. Warriors had to rotate in and out of the front line to stay fresh, which required even more coordination and discipline. It was like playing football while wearing medieval armor and carrying a coffee table as a shield. Viking tactics included much more than just the shield wall. They used encirclement maneuvers to surround smaller enemy forces. They performed feigned retreats to draw enemies into ambushes. They attacked from unexpected directions through forests, marshes, and rough terrain, where formations could not hold together. Vikings were opportunistic fighters who adapted their methods to whatever situation they faced. One favorite tactic was the boar snout or swine array, a wedge formation designed to punch through enemy lines at a specific point. The best fighters formed the tip of the wedge, followed by supporting warriors in a triangular shape. This concentrated force could break through shield walls and create gaps that the rest of the army could exploit. Naval tactics were equally sophisticated. Longships could appear suddenly from fog or around headlands, giving defenders little time to organize resistance. The shallow draft allowed beach landings in places where deeper ships could not go. Crews could run the bow onto shore and disembark armed men within minutes, turning a peaceful shoreline into a combat zone before defenders knew what was happening. In fleet battles, ships would lock together gunwale to gunwale, turning the water into a floating battlefield. Heavily armed men fought along the bow and stern, where boarding actions focused. Some commanders would lash multiple ships together to create stable fighting platforms that could not be easily separated by enemy action. Let's talk about what the actual fighting was like, because this is where movies get everything wrong. The noise alone would have been overwhelming. Wood crashing against wood, metal striking metal, hundreds of men shouting battle cries, screaming in pain, or calling for help. Modern researchers estimate the sound levels would have exceeded what you experience standing next to a jet engine. Your ears would be ringing within minutes, and you would struggle to hear commands, warnings, or surrender attempts. The smell was just as bad as the noise. Unwashed bodies, blood, vomit, and human waste created an atmosphere that would make a sewage treatment plant seem pleasant. Men lost control of their bodily functions. When terrified or wounded, the metallic smell of blood mixed with the stench of opened intestines and the acrid smoke from burning buildings or ships. The psychological impact was intense beyond anything modern people can imagine. Your world shrinks to just a few feet around you. You cannot see the big picture because your helmet limits your vision to what is directly in front of you. You are fighting people you cannot understand because Vikings spoke Old Norse, while their enemies spoke Anglo-Saxon, Gaelic, French, or other languages. Someone could be trying to surrender, and you would have no idea what they were saying. Communication breakdown was a constant problem. Battle cries and commands got lost in the noise. Hand signals were useless when everyone was focused on the enemy in front of them. Messengers had to run between different parts of the battle line, risking death to carry orders that might be obsolete by the time they arrived. It was like trying to coordinate a football team using smoke signals during a hurricane. The fear was constant and overwhelming. Even experienced warriors felt their hands shake and their stomachs churn before combat. Some men vomited from terror. Others lost control of their bowels. A few might faint or run away before fighting even started. Courage was not the absence of fear. It was functioning despite being absolutely terrified. Combat itself was nothing like the elegant sword fighting you see in movies. Real Viking combat looked more like a violent rugby scrum with sharp objects. Fighters did not square off one-on-one in honorable duels. They ganged up whenever possible because this was war, not a sporting event. 5 warriors attacking one enemy was considered smart tactics, not unfair fighting. The goal was to win and survive, not to look heroic while dying. The crush of bodies made proper weapon technique nearly impossible. You had maybe 6 inches of space to move your weapon effectively. The flowing sword techniques taught in modern martial arts classes were useless when pressed shoulder to shoulder with allies and enemies. Most fighting involved awkward stabbing, pushing, and grappling. It was more like fighting someone in a crowded elevator than the open battlefield duels shown in Hollywood productions. Weapons got stuck in shields, armor, and bodies. Your beautiful axe that worked perfectly on practice targets would embed itself in an enemy shield and refuse to come free while someone else tried to kill you. Sword blades snapped under stress or became too dull to cut effectively. Spear shafts broke when too much pressure was applied. Fighting with damaged or improvised weapons was normal, not exceptional. The ground became treacherous within minutes. Blood, mud, and bodies created slippery conditions that sent warriors tumbling. Falling down in combat usually meant death, because you could not defend yourself effectively from the ground, and other fighters would step on you either accidentally or on purpose. Staying upright was often more important than attacking enemies. The wounds tell their own story about how Vikings really fought. Bioarchaeology studies of skeletal remains show that injuries clustered on left forearms and lower legs. This matches exactly what you would expect from shield wall fighting, where your shield arm and the parts of your legs not protected by the shield were the most exposed to enemy weapons. These injury patterns prove that Vikings used coordinated formations rather than individual fighting techniques. 1/3 of examined Viking skeletons show weapon trauma. But here is the interesting part. Healed fractures outnumber fatal wounds 3 to 1. This means that many warriors survived serious injuries and lived to fight again. Viking medicine was more effective than most people realize. and the culture supported wounded veterans in ways that allowed them to recover and return to active service. Skull injuries were common and often fatal. Axes and maces could crush through helmets and cause brain damage that killed immediately or led to death within days. But many skull wounds showed signs of healing, proving that some men survived even severe head trauma. The human skull is tougher than people think, and Viking healers developed effective techniques for treating head injuries. Medical care was basic, but surprisingly effective when available. Healers called Leiknir used honey as an antiseptic, salt water to clean wounds, and herbal medicines like yarrow to reduce bleeding and inflammation. They could set broken bones using splints carved from shipwood and bound with wool strips or leather cords. Surgical techniques included removing arrow points with special tongs and cauterizing wounds with heated metal to stop bleeding. But infection was the real killer that claimed more Viking lives than enemy weapons. More Vikings died from infected wounds than from battle injuries themselves. A small cut from a dirty weapon could mean weeks of fever, delirium, and eventual death as the infection spread through the body. Antibiotics did not exist, so the immune system had to fight infections alone. The cold Scandinavian climate made wound care even more difficult. Injuries would often freeze before they could heal properly, leading to frostbite and tissue death. Wounds that might heal in warmer climates became life-threatening when exposed to harsh northern weather. Fighting in winter meant dealing with hypothermia, frostbite, and the additional stress of extreme cold on top of combat injuries. The great army that wintered at Repton in 873 to 874 shows how Vikings really operated when they were serious about conquest rather than just raiding. Archaeological excavations found a D-shaped earthwork with turf-faced ramparts, garrison barracks, storage areas, workshops, slave pens, and livestock corrals. This was not a temporary camp thrown together by raiders. It was a fortified military base designed to support long-term operations. The mass grave at Repton contains 264 bodies, mostly men aged 18 to 45, along with weapons and jewelry that match Scandinavian styles. Isotope analysis of their teeth shows they came from across Scandinavia, proving this was a truly international force that drew fighters from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and other Norse territories. This was not a local raiding party. It was a multinational corporation dedicated to conquest and profit. Logistics won battles more than individual heroics or superior weapons. A crew of 60 men needed about 180 kilograms, or almost 400 pounds of dried meat, barley, and cheese every week just to maintain basic nutrition. Multiply this by the thousands of men in a great army, and you can see why supply management was critical to success. Ships carried initial supplies, but armies also needed to forage, trade, and capture food from local sources. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Hedeby, Birka, and York shows that Viking fleets relied heavily on livestock rather than hunting or fishing. Cattle, pigs, and sheep provided reliable protein that could be preserved for long voyages using salt, smoking, or drying techniques. Hunting was too unreliable and time-consuming for large forces that needed guaranteed nutrition levels. Supply lines were everything in extended campaigns. Vikings established fortified depots along major rivers and coastlines where they could repair ships, store goods, and overwinter safely. These bases were often built inside existing fortifications like old Roman forts or beside monasteries that could provide local knowledge, resources, and skilled craftsmen. Communication systems in battle were more sophisticated than most people realize. Horn signals could convey basic commands like advance, retreat, or form up. Different horn calls meant different things, and experienced warriors could interpret complex messages from the sequence and timing of blasts. Shield knocking created rhythmic sounds that helped maintain formation timing and coordination during advances or retreats. Banner movements provided visual signals when horn calls could not be heard over combat noise. Weighted banner cords kept flags steady in the wind so they could be seen above the fighting. Different banner positions meant different commands, and runners carried messages between units that were too far apart for visual or audio signals to reach effectively. The reality of Viking psychology in combat was far more complex than berserker stereotypes suggest. These were not mindless killers who enjoyed violence for its own sake. They were farmers, craftsmen, and traders who understood that warfare was a business venture with serious financial risks and potential rewards. Success required careful planning, disciplined execution, and smart decision-making under extreme stress. Reputation mattered enormously in Viking society because it could convince enemies to pay tribute without fighting. A reputation for being unstoppable in battle was worth more than actual military strength because it could end conflicts before they started. Display ships with ornate figureheads, ritual pre-battle ceremonies, and calculated shows of force were all part of psychological warfare designed to intimidate opponents into surrendering. Terror was a tool, not just an emotion. Vikings understood that fear could be more effective than violence in achieving their goals. Enemies who were convinced they could not win would often negotiate rather than fight, saving everyone the costs and risks of actual combat. This approach required Vikings to maintain their fearsome reputation, while also being pragmatic about when to use violence and when to accept negotiated settlements. Prisoners were valuable commodities in the Viking economic system. High-status captives could be ransomed for significant sums of money, silver, or valuable goods. Lower-status prisoners were sold as slaves in international markets at Dublin, Hedeby, York, and other trading centers. The slave trade provided steady income that often exceeded the value of portable loot taken during raids. Mass graves, like the one at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, show that dangerous prisoners were sometimes executed to prevent uprisings or escape attempts. But this was a calculated business decision rather than random violence. Keeping large numbers of hostile prisoners required resources and security that commanders could not always provide. Victory in Viking battles was measured by profit, not glory. A successful raid meant everyone made enough money to justify the risks and expenses of the expedition. This was not about national honor or religious crusades, it was about return on investment for dangerous business ventures. Vikings calculated the costs of ships, supplies, weapons, and time against the potential rewards of loot, ransom, and slave sales. The aftermath of battle looked more like a medieval flea market than a heroic celebration. Valuable armor was stripped from corpses regardless of which side they had fought for. Weapons were collected and evaluated for personal use or resale. Even mundane items like boots, belts, and cooking utensils were taken if they looked useful or valuable. The economics of Viking warfare required careful planning and resource management. Expeditions needed to pay for themselves through loot, ransom, tribute, and slave sales. Failed raids that brought back nothing of value could bankrupt the organizers and leave participants worse off than when they started. Success required intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and tactical flexibility to adapt to unexpected situations. The end of the Viking Age came gradually as warfare changed throughout the 11th and 12th centuries. Heavy cavalry became dominant on European battlefields, making traditional Viking infantry tactics less effective. Stone castles provided defensive advantages that Viking siege techniques could not easily overcome. The rise of centralized kingdoms with professional armies reduced the effectiveness of raiding as a profitable business model. Archaeological evidence continues to update our understanding of how Vikings really fought, lived, and died. Recent excavations reveal new details about battle tactics, weapons technology, and the daily experience of military life. DNA analysis shows that Viking armies included fighters from across northern Europe, not just Scandinavia. So the next time you watch a Viking movie, remember that the real warriors were far more interesting than Hollywood heroes. They were farmers and traders who became part-time soldiers, using practical weapons and flexible tactics to build a network of influence that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. They succeeded not because they were savage berserkers immune to pain and fear, but because they were smart, organized, and willing to adapt their methods to whatever circumstances they faced. The real Vikings were farmers with axes, not Hollywood superheroes. They succeeded through planning, not just violence. Next time you see those horned helmets in movies, you will know better. Give a nod to your inner Viking, pillage that like button, and subscribe for more fascinating journeys into Midgard living.